It was about the third week into Kathy's weight loss battle where things really started to go downhill.
Go big with Taco Bell's Nachos Party Pack. Get yours with Taco Bell delivery.
looking for the best music for your videos? Oh. I don't know if I want the music to cut out yet. That was too good. That was really good. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Conversations Cafe. I am your host, Carl Evans, Senior Director of Operations here at Hope for the Day. It is my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's episode, The Trans Experience. As always, we're going to be having a real badass group of folks talking their truth, and we're going to be holding space to share stories, insights, and education, and hopefully do a little inspiration while we're at it. As you already know, with Conversation Cafe episodes, we're kind of really just always trying to find ways to take bites out of the mental health conversation at its different intersections in our community, even though we know we will never get it all in one bite. And every conversation on mental health is an important one, but they're usually also very large ones. And each one of these episodes is really just designed to try and continue the conversation, pushing it forward, and supply you with a little more information, education, and like I said before, inspiration. And we've had guests on from the trans community before, and as panels and any number of different episodes. This one just happens to sort of be more specifically focused on this intersection. And we thought it was important because, as always, it's important to sort of raise the visibility of all peoples, especially peoples who find themselves marginalized through different experiences and different realities around society. And when we talk about mental health, of course, its biggest obstacle to effective treatment is typically shaped by stigmas, the things we don't say, but also the social and cultural factors that try to dictate how we express ourselves, how we define and operate and live our lives. And whenever we're talking about issues related to identity and orientation, unfortunately, as a point of reality, there are steep cultural factors and impacts that try to dictate, control, repress, oppress, disrupt, and oftentimes harm the ability for individuals to live their truths, to be who they need to be, who they are in society. And when we talk about, I use the term trans, which is a shorthand term, and even that conversation about terms is part of a bigger package that we might touch on some part of it tonight. But when we talk about the trans community, you may not know, and our audience continues to grow. So even if we've touched on these topics before, trans individuals tend to experience higher rates of mental health issues than the general population. And we're not trying to do pain Olympics or create a hierarchy, but rather this is more from survey reporting that we see that in general statistics, nearly 1 in 5 individuals will often report an experience with mental illness like depression or anxiety. But unfortunately, within the transgender community, that number tends to get reported and higher, sometimes as much as one out of every 2. In recent survey studies such as done by the National Center of Transgender Equity, we found that there was a self-reported 41% of individuals surveyed reported having attempted a suicide. And when we talk about mental health and the society and community, we know that self-harming, the act, isn't the only part of the story of who we are. According to a survey by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, of all individuals surveyed, they found that 50% of transgender individuals reported having to teach the medical providers about transgender care, while 19% of individuals in that same survey talked about saying they had been refused care due to their transgender or gender nonconforming status. And that's salient because when we're talking about mental health and we're talking about the way it impacts different intersections in our community, talking about the rates of how someone might harm themselves is one feature of it, but talking about how they have to navigate their lives in society is something that we also need to illustrate. And I bring up the idea of being subjected to prejudice and segregation, quite frankly, and in the medical fields, in the medical world, or just having to educate someone, how do you advise and provide proper care to yourself? that challenge can create a dramatic obstacle, a dramatic impasse between being able to get the right kind of care and being able to verbalize your needs. And when we talk about prevention, when we talk about trying to disrupt the highest risk factors for mental health crisis, we're talking about a situation in which prevention begins with conversations. And if stigma can make any individual feel silent about their experiences, if we find that there are these conditions, and I just talked about two really tiny little factors that don't comprehensively paint the whole experience, but I picked those two sort of statistical facts, or those two statistical facts to talk about the fact to try to illustrate that basic conversations for personal medical care, if you are hesitant or concerned to even have those kind of conversations, imagine what that can do to contributing to building escalation for undertreated or untreated mental health challenges. But whenever we talk about individuals in different segments of the human population and their experiences, it's important to understand that it's not just about negative statistics either, because far too often for marginalized people, the only time they ever appear and the only time we're ever brought up in normalized conversation is the suffering, is to sort of create almost a trope of a pity trope. And I think it's important that we also make sure that we're doing our best to, when we talk about raising the visibility, we talk about the full rounded picture that human beings are thriving and striving and finding ways, even in the face of dark and nasty sort of forms of repression and abuse and prejudices. This doesn't mean that people, through their own brilliance and creative endeavors and the fire of their spirits, aren't finding ways to live their truths and go out into the world and obtain what they need in spite of. And so our episodes are never really just all about one thing or the other thing, as you all know, and for our newer audiences, as you're learning. And tonight, it's going to be the same thing. We're probably going to touch on quite a few different topics and different interests, different sort of facets of the experience. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And without further ado, I want to bring on our panel so we can really get going here. First thing I'm going to do is introduce just our guests to make sure that we can hear and see them, unmute them and get them on camera. So first I've got Nate here. Nate, can we see you? Can we hear you? Let's get Nate unmuted and on camera. We're going to need to unmute Nate. How are we doing there?
We good?
Okay, definitely can hear you, Nate. Definitely waiting to see you. Tick, 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 tick.
Wow, I must really be having a hiccup with this. I tried my computer here again, and this didn't work out so well. So,
well, we can definitely hear you.
Great. Well, let's see. Oh, I do have the host has asked to start my video. Excellent.
Okay, boom. There it is.
All right. Mystery.
All right. Perfect. Thanks, Nate. Next up, Noopur. Can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hello.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Next up, Ryan. Can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hello.
Not yet. Yeah, we heard Ryan for sure. Ryan. Do we have the camera rocking and rolling? Oh, there it is. There we go.
Hello.
Yo.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for joining us. And Laurel, can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to see all you wonderful human beings. And what I thought would be a good way to kick off things is to do a little bit of introduction round robin. And I'm going to just reverse the table, do a little bit of an Uno reverse here. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves, just sort of, professionally, what you get up to these days. Starting with Laurel.
Hi there. I'm Laurel James. I am a comedian. I do sketch and stand-up comedy here in Chicago. Um, and I'm also a barista at Sip of Hope, which is Hope for the Day's coffee shop. If you're watching this, I feel like you might know that, but thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. And then going backward, or I guess we're always moving forwards, but Ryan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Casada. I am a singer-songwriter, actor, and activist. I am trans, and yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Cool. Noopur?
Yes. Hello, I'm Noopur. I'm a therapist in Chicago. I'm non-binary, and I'm stoked to be part of this panel.
Awesome. And Nate?
Hi, I'm Nate. I'm joining you from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I'm a transgender man. I have written 2 books and have my MFA from Hamline University here. I do a lot of trainings, not only for mental health and suicide awareness, but a lot around police and corrections, crisis intervention trainings for police and corrections and other social service agencies. So that's kind of where my heart is right now and a lot of the work that I've been doing.
Well, I just want to, of course, thank all of you for joining us. And last week we were talking with wonderful folks from First Nations and Indigenous tribes of North America. And one of the things that came up in that conversation that really sort of, again, changed my thinking process a little bit or impacted my thinking process was Damon Leader Charge mentioned that, I said, what's good allyship? And he's like, well, we're not really looking for allies. It's better to be good partners. And I thought that was kind of a real interesting thing. And so moving it along today, what I'm kind of wondering where we start is sort of if folks could sort of learn a little bit about, why this intersection is relevant to you, why it sort of impacts you and why you wanted to come on today. And here I'm going to sort of just imagine I threw the talking stick up in the air and anyone can sort of grab it and maybe tell a little bit about why, from your background, why this is an intersection that you're very passionate about and connect with. So I'm trying not to put anyone on the spot, but Nate, Nate's first.
I'd be happy to speak on that. I think this is a really crucial intersection to speak about as someone who, I'm 40, so growing up in Iowa in the 80s, you just didn't talk about gender identity. And being in Minnesota for 20 years is a place where there is a lot of open dialogue around mental health. But again, I kind of felt that the gender identity piece wasn't quite there and can sometimes be misunderstood in the sense of if I speak openly as a transgender person with mental illness, that could project this image to the rest of the world that people who are transgender are mentally ill or that they are one and the same, that being transgender is a mental illness. And so I think that intersection is crucial in trying to break some of the circles of stigma and prejudice that we do see.
I know everyone's, we're going to all jump in on this, but for that piece there, there's that whole sort of that discomfort, or maybe it's marginally controversial, but the idea of how often tied to transgender is the term, because it's in the DSM-5 now about dysmorphia and the discomfort with making that sort of correlation between mental health, tying in, when we're talking about like gender dysmorphia, the controversy there of like, it helps with getting access to services, but are we now correlating it to an illness which has like the shadows and the shades of the darker days of defining homosexuality as illnesses? I don't know if that's kind of in a wheel that you wanted to touch on, but since you brought it up, the stigma correlated with it, I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that.
For gender dysphoria, I think I actually had a psychiatrist that talked with me about a different diagnosis of having body dysmorphia, and I thought, well, that doesn't fit quite right. But I believe what you're referring to is the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. and that sense of disconnect between the inner sense of self and what your body is projecting. And absolutely, I think that the fact that it is included in the DSM can make it a hurdle to overcome. I guess my personal concern about it is that it has been kind of classified as a sexual fetish or a sexual issue, which puts it in with some other diagnoses that could be kind of maybe not so becoming. And certainly I think that's something that can feel shameful as a person who is transgender. I didn't want to be in that category. And certainly you don't want to see yourself as having an illness. I started having mental health challenges at 12, and I know that that's a big piece of what I battle, but my gender identity is very, very different from that. So, but I have absolutely no doubt that having had 2 suicide attempts, first one was very much precipitated by chemical use and the manifestation of that with my mental illness. But the second one very much was precipitated by that gender dysphoria, by that disconnect, by the fact that I am a person living with a disability, both a neurological illness and a mental illness that could not get through the gatekeeping. And that was a big piece of what tipped me to that second suicide attempt that I'm very lucky to have survived. So I think that the correlation there, it definitely can have an impact on your mental health. And absolutely that internal sense of self-loathing can be dramatic. But the question of whether we include it as a diagnosis, I guess there are a lot of different professionals around the world and different organizations that are trying to kind of figure out how we do identify folks that can be assisted and helped by having that. So we don't identify a heart disease and what criteria meets that, then it can be hard to work with how to provide treatment.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of give a chance that anyone wanted to piggyback on that or had any thoughts that came up. I would just want to underscore the importance that for especially folks who maybe aren't as comfortable in this conversation, to not think of trans as a mental illness, to not make that bridging correlation, which might seem common sense to some of our audience, but sometimes in very sloppy conversations, there's this weird conflation that happens where people think we're talking about mental illness or a challenge. So then continuing on with the conversation, did anyone sort of want to talk about where they sort of come in on this intersection and how they feel about it?
Sure, yeah. Everything you said, Nate, I so agreed with. I connected with a lot of that. I really think that being trans impacts the way that I move through getting mental health help, and it certainly creates issues in my life that worsen my mental health, but it does feel sort of inherently separate. I think while there are hard parts to being trans, my transness has nothing to do with illness or feeling depressed, though there are moments that are depressing, you know? I think for me, the journey to realizing that I was trans very much happened through seeking mental health help. So while I was in treatment for an eating disorder, I had a really great therapist who was well educated on gender. And she posed to me that maybe why the treatment, which had been sort of outlined for cisgender girls to go through, maybe part of the reason why I felt so disconnected and wasn't really fitting in with that style of treatment is because what I was actually experiencing is gender dysphoria. So I think if you look just on the surface, things can sometimes look similar, but sometimes your mental illness is a clue that you need to get comfortable with the gender part of yourself. So.
Anyone I see nodding heads, and just jump in when you feel good.
I'm gonna jump right in after Laurel. I am like exclamation marking both what you both have said so far. And I think like this, before I go into like my own story a little bit, like I think what we're talking about around folks identifying trans identity as like a mental health issue is a huge problem, even in like my profession. I have clients who come in and say like, hey, I'm trans, but that has nothing to do with my mental health issues. And so we talk about like, oh my God, how many therapists out there are kind of putting both of those pieces together. In addition to that, I also think that there is, although those two aren't interrelated, I think like how the world sees trans folks impacts our mental health. So it's not necessarily because we're trans, it's because of how we're treated and like how we're perceived. And so that's, I think, a huge piece. In terms of like the intersection of mental health and transness for me, I just came out last year because I began working at a primarily queer private practice in the city, and I guess felt affirmed by all the folks. And I think everything made sense when I was around people that were like me. I'm first generation Indian, grew up in a really middle, high class, conservative city. And so there wasn't really access to even that language until my adulthood. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
I'll jump in here. Yeah, I definitely agree with what everyone else is saying as well. And I honestly, like, I've been out now since I was a young teenager. So I have walked through this world as an openly trans and queer person for over a decade now. And my anxiety about my transition mostly was before I got top surgery. And after I got top surgery, a lot of that eased. And that was because I felt more comfortable. And I don't know, is it because I feel like less awkward walking through the world? Because I feel like a lot of my anxiety now, it's mostly about like how trans people are oppressed in the world. Like every day going out, like especially before COVID and we actually like went places, like using a public bathroom is terrifying. Like I am a very androgynous looking person. I am misgendered daily. Like that's the norm for me. And that's how it is. And so the anxiety comes up a lot about how other people react to me. And that anxiety comes from fear because I'm afraid for my life. So it's like fight or flight. And a lot of the mental health issues that I currently struggle with are due to experiences that I've had from people that do not like trans people, and they decided to be violent verbally, physically, sexually. And that is something that is so stigmatized as well. And yeah, I just want to speak up on that. I feel like a lot of trans people have this experience. A lot of trans people have the experience of not being accepted by their families, not being accepted by their friends, not being accepted in school, and they're bullied online or in school. And all of those things can result in anxiety and fear and PTSD and things like that. So it is really important to talk about all of this stuff. And like, I thank you for giving us a platform to be able to do this today.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I appreciate again what each of you brings here and sharing with us. And you Ryan, you touched on something that I think I'm interested to know about. So if there's identity in the internal sort of exploration, there's also expression, right? The sort of the external expression, and that's a thing that probably has a gigantic sort of like ball. Like as I warned at the start of the show, there's a lot of heavier things here, and I'm just kind of wondering if I may ask, people put such a fixation on the anatomical part, but when you think of the stigmas and the brutality of prejudice and oppression, it makes it easy to fixate on the external part. But I'm just sort of wondering, how have each of you navigated the expression side of it. If there's the identity thing where maybe you can sort of do an internal check and you come to a place you're like, yeah, okay, this is definitely this was what this is the truth. But then there's the expression part where the external, presentation, and there can be a bridge there. It could be like, all right, well, that is what it is. I don't know if anyone sort of wanted to touch on that, because obviously, Ryan, you brought up sort of going through a process to sort of align, I suppose. Would that be an appropriate way to put that? To align the identity and expression, or is that, I don't know if that's problematic or not.
Well, so my expression, I've actually, since I was a very young kid, I've always expressed myself the way that I wanted to, with how I dressed and everything. Like, I've been wearing a baseball hat since I was like 3 years old. And gender expression, like how I dress and how I express myself in the world, it's just who I authentically am. And it comes from like, hey, this is how I feel comfortable going out in the world. And sometimes that expression is altered when I don't feel safe. Like when I'm traveling in the South, I might dress a little more stereotypical mask so that I feel a little less of a target, right? But my expression, I would say, I mean, that's something that I think of every day, but it's not something I think about in terms of gender. And I don't think it has been much unless I'm in a position where I am afraid. It's really just about like, hey, I like this shirt. I like this hat. I like these glasses. Like, I want to wear this. Like, and for me, things don't really have a gender. And that's just how it's been for me. And my identity, I've actually been diving in a lot deeper to this because I used to very much resonate with identifying as a trans man and a trans guy and trans boy and FTM and all of this. And, I still feel those terms in my soul, but like lately I don't care as much about the label. And I realized like people actually like don't need to know the label of my gender. Like, all they need to know is my name and my pronouns. That's it. That's really all people need to know. They don't need to know like all of these boxes and everything, especially strangers, My friend Kate Bornstein and me and my friend Avery Holiday, we came up with, well, I guess we didn't come up with it, but we thought of it, post-gender. And it's called post-gender, and it's like going beyond those labels and not feeling like we have to do that anymore, and we could just exist in this world. And I really feel that way. In a meditation recently, the question that I've been asked more times than I could count, are you a boy or a girl, came into my head. And that question came into my head, and I thought, are you a boy or a girl? Like someone else asking me that. And my response in my head was, I just am. And that's it. Like, I'm just here. I'm existing. I'm getting to be alive on this planet. I'm getting to have a human experience. And the labels, they don't matter that much to me anymore. And yes, they are a way to find community and find other people that are similar to you. But for me, now, like, I have a community, and that's a privilege. And I live in a very liberal city. I live in LA, and that's also a privilege. And I just get to exist pretty freely here. So yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. I think for me, what you were saying here, it resonated with me when you were talking about, nobody needs to know. And that is true. I guess my experience has been, though, that there are times when we do have to disclose that, and how we're expressing ourselves doesn't necessarily align with how the world is seeing us. And that can be very difficult for folks. So as someone who started my transition in 2012, now 8 years in, it's very apparent that I've been on testosterone and have a receding hairline and all that to show for it. But that's in line with how I would like to be seen. I don't want to be bald, but I want to be seen as a man. And there's been something of a faux pas about that it's been difficult for me as someone who was 40, like I said, and grew up as a girl in a place in Iowa where it was really the only girl playing ice hockey in pretty much the entire state, deemed a trailblazer, a pioneer. Now seeing some of the pushback that I've gotten since I've transitioned because I am male has been very challenging. And add to that, then now that I work with police and corrections on a lot of these very sensitive topics, and I've gotten a lot of pushback, not only within the trans community, but the community at large. And I've had those same feelings that you've described as well, feeling unsafe and knowing when it's not safe to disclose those things. But part of why I have tried to bridge that gap with some of the first responders, for example, is when I woke up out of that coma and I was still female by my anatomy and would still probably run into a situation. I don't know. I haven't had any bottom surgery, but if I were to wake up from a coma, there's a catheter. And that kind of brought me to attention right away that how I was trying to express myself wasn't in line with my anatomy. And the same thing would be true for folks that are encountering the criminal justice system. It's just very binary. And that's unfortunately just the way it is at this particular juncture, but that's not how we are. And that's not how the world is that is around us. So getting folks to see how you want to be, the way that you want to be seen, it can be really, really difficult. And I think there are times when it can be important to be transparent about that, but being mindful of that safety. And that's something that I try and talk with police officers and corrections officers about, that you may run into folks that are coming into a binary system. They might not want to reveal what their gender is, but when it comes down to the safety of that person, it becomes this mental conundrum then too of, when do I reveal this? Does it get to the point where it's the strip search, or do I tell them right away, or do I end up in the general population and then not know what's going to happen? There can be a lot of really tricky things about that. So I'm not trying to debate or anything. I'm just kind of piggybacking on what you said and adding a little different viewpoint to that in times when we do have to disclose that to strangers. And I guess I've put myself out there in a place where it's been tricky to put that out there, and then at the same time wonder, will that be used against me by the very officers that I have shared that information with? That's a scary thing, being in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, for example. We know what's happened around these parts. So that, there's a lot of social tension in that those areas and how we express ourselves, and that mindfulness of safety. I think you raised very, very good points. I think there are also times when in healthcare and in other systems like that, when we have to tell folks and maybe we don't want to. I had that experience recently going through TSA, as I know a lot of other trans folk have experienced a very uncomfortable situation going through TSA.
Thank you both. Because it's important that people understand that this isn't some sort of like convenient linear discussion as if it's all black and white. And I think a point to bring out here is the absurdity or the frustrations that are based on a society that shapes a lot of its language and thought, maybe social thought, on the illusion of the binary structure and links to gender. This was a topic that was brought up last week, or it was touched on last week, in the fact that within any number of indigenous peoples tribes, there's a whole spectrum of relationships linked within what we think of as gender identity, in different languages for it. That whereas here, this binary thing really is trying to force people to have to make an A or B choice, and there's the limitations of our language, maybe, and the thought processes that attach to that and get rigid in there becomes a bigger, seems to be the problem, more so than people recognizing, the variations between the internal experience and the internal experience and navigating all the parts of that. And the fact that it has to come down to safety just shows like the pressing critical need to try and break down these sort of like walls of ignorance and presumption that are out there. I want to sort of, Laurel and Noopur, if you wanted to sort of jump in here, I saw your heads nodding a lot. And just sort of talk about, so the journey through being who you need to be, especially when Ryan was talking about sort of post-gender, everyone was sort of like really perking up. And I kind of want to circle back to that too, because there are things, if the language is always evolving and we're always moving forward, there's even the idea that someone has finished transitioning. Well, they don't want to be identified as trans anymore because I am man, I am woman. Let's rock and roll, and off to the dust. And I don't know if that is a part of this conversation, like bridges in where we are here, or maybe there's a different direction y'all would like to sort of go right in this moment here.
Sure, yeah. One thing I think is interesting about that is it sort of depends on like where you are, not only on your own journey, but if you're choosing to pursue a medical transition, where you are in that journey can so greatly impact if you want to be seen as a trans person or not. And I think, I have definitely pursued medical transition, and I've been on testosterone, but even, on testosterone, I'm not perceived as, oh, that's me. I'm not perceived as a transmasculine person. I think I'm typically read as a cisgender lesbian. And for me, that's fine day to day. I don't trust strangers with the information that I'm trans because I don't trust the general public to not be transphobic. And so I think it's one of those moments where like being able to claim that label and be open about my gender is something exciting and risky that I don't necessarily move through the world with every day. It very much is so circumstantial.
Yeah, I kind of have I don't know, my experience feels like a blend of everything that has been said. I think I present more mask, and I think that's with the intention of like my own safety generally. If I'm misgendered out in public, I don't really have the courage quite yet, thinking about my safety, like to correct people and to like trust that, like Laurel said, that they won't be transphobic and violent ultimately. So yeah, that's kind of how I move day to day. And I'm also thinking about like gender expression. I have always been quote unquote a tomboy since I was like very little. And it always felt like I had to be part of this binary. So when I first was exploring my own gender, I was like, oh, maybe I'm a man. I don't know. And I feel like being non-binary, I feel like people might even have more language around like trans man, trans women versus like non-binary, because that's literally a gray area, and society functions on such a binary. So it feels hard, and I don't necessarily disclose to many folks unless I have to.
Yeah, and it's that I really thank you all again for continuing to share, because it's these self-assessments and the self-determination is such an important part of getting for each of you to your stage of what's your better, your happy, your ideal state of living, especially where our society spends a lot of time demanding people in general to comply. And then there's also, especially for marginalized people, the illusion of compliance too, that you need to fit exactly in script to be the right insert like what's going to fit into the marginalized box thing. And I wonder about that here, where there is no like one right way to live the trans experience, right? So I just really thank you all for helping to illustrate, because one of the things we don't want to do is, have you ever found yourselves in a position where you suddenly had to become the navigator, the I forget what the popular term is. I would call like the Negro like tour guide for Black folks. You know what I mean? So like, I just wondering, like, have you ever caught yourself in that position where all of a sudden like you're being asked to speak like for everybody, and like, I don't know. I hear the uniqueness in each one of your experiences. So that thought just came up. If anyone sort of had a thought on that.
Yeah. Oh, that just really brought back a memory for me. I was dating a person who asked me if I was ever going to transition fully. And in that moment, I was like, fully, what could fully mean? You know, do I have to like get an entirely new body? Like truly to have transitioned fully? Do I have to like get new chromosomes? I don't know what fully would mean for you. But I guess yes, because I've fully arrived at being my gender already. Obviously, like you do the things that make you feel most comfortable, to see yourself the way that you want to be seen. But it really felt like I had to walk this person through the idea of like, there is no fully. And even if I did everything medically the way that people want me to, I still would never meet cisgender standards. That's not there for me.
Yeah, there's so much education involved in like the day-to-day conversations with folks, especially if you disclose that you're trans or whatever. Yeah, it feels like, I mean, I probably have so many examples that I'm not able to bring one up in this moment, but yeah, like Laurel was saying, there's a lack of understanding of what it means to be trans, right? It's such a spectrum, and people are like, oh, have you fully transitioned? And what does that mean to put me back in the binary where I'm like literally trying not to be part of? So yeah.
No, go on, Ryan, please.
Sorry, Carl. Yeah, I wanted to jump in. Throughout my whole transition, I've like never been someone that like has passed, so I've always been visible. So what I was saying before, I'm not saying like I don't disclose I'm trans, because I am trans and obviously queer to stereotypes or whatever, and I'm very open about that. So I just wanted to put that out there. But with what we were just talking about, because I came out while I was in high school, basically like I had to either become an activist and educate my entire school or just not go to school. And that was my reality. And back in when I came out in like 2008, it was a very, very different experience where saying the word transgender, no one knew what that was. It was very, very rare for someone to know what that was. And now you could say the word trans and like most people know what it is now. But back then, like you say trans, people think you're talking about a train or something. Like people had no idea. And now it's extremely different. But coming out that young, I had to educate. I had to stand in my hallway with petitions. I had to answer everyone's questions. When I came out, just to be able to get people, my teachers, to call me the right name and pronouns, I had to like draw on their blackboards in school and like make a trans umbrella and explain the different terms and like why you should respect people. So, I mean, that's been my experience my whole life, and I have no regrets for that at all. I'm glad that I had the strength and the bravery to stand up and say, you know what, I deserve to be in school, so I'm going to fight for this. And I hope that when the next trans person who walks through the hallways of these schools will have a much easier time because of that I'm educating, right? So, I mean, that's always been a thing. And definitely for some reason, people think that they could just ask trans people random questions whenever they want. And that's also a thing.
A lot of anatomy questions.
Yeah, and that's too, like, people don't need to know what's in your pants unless you want to tell them. But that's more of what I was saying before. And for me, people, like, when I go to the doctor, they do ask my pronouns. They do ask what kind of anatomy I have, because I definitely do not pass as a cis guy in this world, especially not as an adult. So they ask my age. They sometimes ask, like, are your parents okay with you being here or whatever? Like, you know, that happens to me still. And I guess being visible and not passing has given me a different experience. But I've gotten to the point where like, I don't care if people see me as male or not. I just care if people respect me, and that's it. And by that, I mean, call me my name and call me my pronouns, you know, and I'll respect you too.
I've had kind of an interesting experience with this because this is a lot of what I do is provide talks and educational lectures for different audiences. So I get asked a lot of questions, and I try to be open about it in large part because a lot of what drove my dysphoria to a place where I did have a suicide attempt in 2011 was A, the gatekeeping, B, the mental health, but C, I also had a book that came out, my first memoir did come out with my previous name on it, with my female name. So with that out in the world and still being out in the world and being a book that was used as a teaching tool, it's a little more difficult for me to just kind of conceal that aspect of my history. And I've been very open about trying to integrate that into my world. But I definitely, starting the transition in 2012, have had some interesting experiences. And as a person that's living with what's considered a rare neurological disorder, I live with dystonia, which is a first cousin of Parkinson's disease that causes abnormal muscle contractions and spasms. And it's very painful and it's uncomfortable and it requires very specialized care. These doctors were one that I'd had for a couple of years when I underwent my transition finally. And after top surgery, and I did have to take my shirt off, it was kind of a moment of, this is different. And finally, the coordinator said, we're sorry, please understand, we're getting a little old. And so it was a kind of one of those generational things where at that point, then I was able to kind of talk with them about how that surgery unfolded and, you know, they could see obviously the outcome there and having just had the surgery, but I was there to do the procedure for my Botox injections for my neurological condition. They needed to get at that part of my body. So it was incumbent upon me that I be open about some of that stuff and answer some of those questions. So again, very contingent upon where you're at and what those circumstances are and what you want to divulge. But definitely I can relate to being asked some interesting things. And for example, were your forearms always that hairy? You know, things like that, that are just kind of out there. In places you wouldn't expect, places like the workplace. I thought maybe that was just unique to healthcare, but it sounds like maybe that is something that goes out into other fields as well. And I think the other thing is that I was very blessed when I started my transition and I started working in the field of dementia. And though while a very serious symptom of dementia for a lot of folks that are battling that illness, gender becomes a non-existent thing. And it can be something that everyone mixes up. You might call your daughter your son, and you know that's going to be painful, certainly for the family. But from my perspective, when I started working there and my name badge changed and my physical appearance started to change, it was the folks that were actually living with cognitive impairment that were the first ones to be able to say, well, he's just such a cute young man. And I just felt so validated by that was really when I think it started to feel real for me that I could be seen for the man that I knew I was supposed to be. And that can be a very empowering thing too. And that definitely ties into improved mental health.
It's definitely one of the most counterintuitive affirmations working with someone with dementia and finding validation. But I did not want to cut off anyone else who wanted to come in on there.
I just have like a quick blip, like to go off of like Ryan talking about like respecting pronouns and Nate talking about like being affirmed by that experience. Like I think something that's really important to know is that like respecting names and pronouns is suicide prevention. I mean, really, that's like period. That was it. That was all I wanted to blip in there.
Well, no, but I mean, would you feel comfortable elaborating how that connects? Because, you know, there might be people who don't necessarily, it might be hard to appreciate what that means. What is that connecting to, if you don't mind?
Yeah, of course. And I hope my fellow folks will add on with their own experiences. But I think that like, it's like being called, I don't know, the proper name, the proper pronoun is affirming who you are. And even if you don't understand something, I think there's something huge about just respecting it. It feels yeah, it feels like really large to explain how like just doing that is suicide prevention. Yeah, just like being affirmed by who you are.
Okay, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you did sort of pivot if anyone else wanted to jump on that, and I don't know if this is anyone get some nodding heads here, but if not, what I would sort of want to something
Carl,
I did.
I want to add just one quick thing on
Sure, please.
pronouns. Having a background, I started my career as a paralegal, and when I developed my neurological condition, I had to make a change and subsequently left that field. But in the field of law, it feels like an area where if I were working as a paralegal now, I think I would struggle a little more with putting my pronouns in the email signature, for example, because I might be communicating with people in a different state where it might be unsafe, or the laws might be very different, where I might be running into prejudice just by putting that out there in an email. And I'll give an example of an interview I read with a trans woman who I believe works for, well, I won't say the bank name, but a very, very large bank out in New York. And she has said in interviews that she will not, although she supports putting pronouns in an email signature, won't do that because she works with international clients and is therefore could lose that business relationship and jeopardize her own clients by disclosing that information. So I think there's a time and a place for that, definitely. I've personally just have had concerns at times about where we put that out and whether that could tie into some of the safety concerns that folks have had.
And I
just
think that's
safe and mindful, I think, is kind of the bottom line about how we disclose that information.
And but that's critical to understand. I think it's we want to say that there's things that are getting better, and we want to say that with better understanding. But the word that has to keep coming up, or the word that keeps coming up about safety, is something that I think I would not in good faith be able to necessarily ignore, because it does not go, unfortunately, you don't go a couple of months, and we saw particularly this summer a spike in violence and lethal violence against members of the trans community. That sense of talking about being safe, there's the social impact, and that safety is there because losing your economic stability obviously is just as much a part of suicide prevention as keeping people fed and keeping people housed and keeping people safe from the nature's elements. But the idea of safety, and why I'm kind of tying this into the idea of recognizing and affirming someone's gender identity, someone's pronouns, is part of the bigger mission of we don't want people to have to spend their time being so rigidly concerned about having to be safe. Like, we want to mitigate lethal reality, right? There's people marching against cops because they like to be able to walk or play with a gun in a park or sleep without a thing happening. So, and I'm not making light of that. What I kind of like to do as the time, we can, as we're sort of shaping this conversation, is talk about tools to be safe. Like, what if, we've talked about it and talked about things you've actively done. And I just sort of wonder out there, because we do have people, we see it. And I'm the one who sees the emails come in as much as other members of our wonderful team. But there are people who are younger, who pay attention to what we do, who are part of our audience, who do have concerns about being safe, about where they're early on in their navigation, and just even uttering the words, I think I might be, and the might be may not have like a concrete answer yet. They don't, it's a hazy cloud, but just trying to get into that cloud, that links back to, that can be a road to bad results for one's mental health, because you're never permitted to go down those journeys, or you're blocked from it. So what I'd really like to sort of just talk about right now, to everyone's comfort level, if you feel that way, really just talk about the safe. If we've got younger and even older, Jesus Louise, like 40 or 50 years old, and there's people who may be just beginning this conversation. So your thoughts as best as you can. You can't speak for everyone in the world and the community, but as best as you can, I'd like to sort of talk about the safety part, about what you found of tools of safety. Just you've touched on it already, but I kind of like to hit the nail right on the head because I think it's a critical part of helping support others find their journeys too. And I'm not asking you to become, well, so Ryan, you are actively an advocate, and Nate, and you've all in your ways been advocates, but sort of to yourself, what have you found is sort of like part of keeping safe? And that's a real unwieldy question, but I think it's important we touch on it.
Yeah. When I was coming out, the conversations that queer people were having surrounding coming out was very much pro. You just have to come out, rip the Band-Aid off. If you get rejected by your community, by the people around you, by your family, you have to deal with those consequences. And now I think having gone through that experience, and I'm just watching culture change, the conversation is so much more centered around come out when you are safe and when you are ready to do that. And if there are certain people in your life who you know will react in a violent way, those are not people that you have to share that information with. Obviously, it depends on your situation. But I can remember when I was hospitalized for a suicide attempt, when I got there, right, you go into this new environment of doctors. You don't know who they are. You don't know their personal politics. You don't know their level of comfort working with trans patients. And in that moment, knowing I had to be there for a week, I chose not to disclose trans identity and to sort of like hold that back, test the waters, see how we were doing, and see if it was a safe environment to share something like that. And in the end, I did feel like it was a safe place to move forward with that. You can always, come out later, but once that information is out, you can never really pull it back in. And I think, it was to everyone's benefit in the end because so at the time I was taking testosterone and I needed a new prescription for it while in the hospital. I didn't bring my medication. And I had to sit down with doctors and explain to them what it means to be transgender. And they kept asking, are you taking testosterone because you're a bodybuilder? And I was like, I'm not a bodybuilder. But I'm happy to be here, like, educating you about this now that I know you're going to come from a place of like, I don't understand, but I'm trying to, rather than like, I understand, but I'm not interested in helping.
Thank you for sharing
I think that's a good point. I just wanted to say the way I've heard that termed is practicing cultural humility versus cultural competence. And you can be competent in understanding a concept, but really when you're in a situation like that humbleness of, hey, you're the expert, this is your lived experience, you tell me what's going on, can be really, really empowering.
Yeah, I love that. Cultural humility versus, cultural competence. That's great.
I usually, like, people ask, like, okay, I don't know if my parents are going to accept me or not when I come out, and I always recommend like having some resources before, whether that's your local LGBT center, the It Gets Better project. If you go to their website, and you type in your address, like it will literally tell you like all the closest resources to your city, which is amazing. So that's like a really good resource too. And I just recommend having like a backup plan if you're young or if your housing is unstable or could become unstable. For me, like navigating safety in the world, like just, I always am very, very aware of my surroundings. I try not to be in like a secluded place. There are places in Los Angeles, venues, and in my more conservative home that I won't go to, or I'll be like, all right, like I'll be there for like 2 hours, can't stay longer because I don't feel safe using the bathroom there, right? And it's like navigating all those things. Like I've picked to go to places that I know have gender neutral bathrooms, even though the food isn't as great, right? And yeah, I guess for me, like with like disclosing and stuff, I guess I lost that option. So I haven't really like thought about that much. since I came out on international television when I was 15 years old, and since then I've been in a lot of articles and stuff. And you know, if I'm playing a show and a flyer is up around the town and it says my name, like people could very easily find out that I'm trans. And you know, it's not something that I hide, and I don't think it's something that I could hide. Like I don't, even if I went on T or something, I don't think I could really be stealth unless I change my name and wear like a mask over my whole head or something. But yeah, so I totally recommend, like, for me, just throughout the years I've learned, like, all right, if I'm with like a cis male friend, ask them to come in the bathroom with me. My brothers have come in the bathroom with me so many times or guarded the door. And I always just make sure, like, okay, does this door lock? Like, does this stall door lock? Is this, if something does happen, is this hallway like too long from the rest of people and they won't be able to hear me yell for someone for help, right? And it's like every time I use a public bathroom, like this is what goes through my head. What is my getaway plan for this? And that's like my reality. And I don't have any shame in it. I don't have any shame in not passing or being androgynous. Like, I'm very proud to be who I am, and I'm very proud to be out and to have been able to walk this path. And I do believe that being trans is a blessing for me because it's connected me with so many beautiful people all over the world, and it's given me a great sense of purpose and a great sense of community, and those things are really good for your mental health. So I am very honored to be a part of this community.
Oh, yeah. Thank
For
you.
me, I think safety has been something that has always been something that's kind of, like Ryan said, it's just kind of there. I just take things into consideration as they're happening and try to be mindful of that gut sense. I think your gut sense is there for a reason. If it doesn't feel safe, then maybe consider another course. And definitely, I've had experiences where it has proved to be unsafe. I did join a gym not too long into my journey with testosterone, so was still very much in appearing more non-binary, but did use the men's shower and not realizing that actually the chemical dependency facility that I was working at had brought their other unit staff or clients over. I was working with the LGBT population, and they brought the other group over, the non-LGBT group. So these folks knew that I was a transgender person. They knew that I was a counselor there. And this was a very uncomfortable moment where I had a dodgeball thrown at my head at the pool and knew right then that I needed to get away from these two gentlemen. They did follow me back up into the locker room, and I just tried to get out of there as quick as I could. But it was, my saving grace was finding a single stall bathroom. And I just kind of hung out in there until I felt that it was safe for me to go out, then reported it to the front. And, you know, a very minor incident compared to what a lot of people do experience in every day, but just one of those things that made me very, very much aware early in my transition that even though at that point I was embracing my ability to go swimming as a guy who was, you know, post-top surgery, I needed to be very careful about that setting. And so that said, I've also taken steps to make sure that I'm not putting myself in situations around the city that, like Ryan said, kind of making sure I'm not going to certain areas. And I actually did move out of the city of Minneapolis last year to outside of St. Paul, where I feel I'm safer. And there are some reasons behind that, but I won't get into that. Gut sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for like all those things, I think it's like being cognizant of my surroundings always. If I'm walking around alone day or night, I don't wear my headphones. I make sure I can hear like everything and just like become attuned to every sense that I have. Something I'm thinking about around like safety, Carl, you were talking about like kids who are exploring their gender and like how to facilitate safety for them feels really important. In my work, I used to primarily work with kids and now still do and work with trans kids. So, I mean, Ryan said it really well around like using that website and finding like local resources, because I think a lot of the time it can be unsafe to not come out even as a kid, and it could be more detrimental to stay closeted or closed or whatever you'd like to define that as. And so like having local resources, it feels hard, but like hopefully having some support, trusted adults. I don't know. I feel like that's harder for kids, especially if there's a lack of safety in their own home. So I also think like how we are all kind of showing up here and doing this virtual panel, hopefully some kids and folks who might need it have access to this and know that like we are also here, at least I am, if anyone is needing to just like talk or needing some additional support to discover themselves.
Yeah, I think finding, maybe if you can't like physically be out when you're young with your family, and like you can't always present the way that you want, and that can be so detrimental to your mental health. I think finding spaces that you can be out, even if it's just an online community. I know that was such a big part of my coming out. And yeah, like create a space for yourself where you can actually explore that and be the fullest version of yourself, even if you're not ready for that to be shared with everyone in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't thank you enough for contributing those pieces, because obviously, it's not to suggest you speak for everyone, but telling your parts, like this is important. I think it's one of the best things we can do, is just your personal insights. That's more powerful for a lot of people than reading a blog about here's what you can do. So I always find that much more impacting. And I think right here is a good place to sort of put a small pin in it. By your graces, I'd really like to have you all come on again and bring on some other guests as well, and continue the discussions, because we like to build our family. And you're all wonderful, fabulous folks contributing. And I think one of the things that's important for us to always remember is that we need to think of these conversations as something that should not wait for a holiday or an awareness day. Keep the awareness days, they're good. But, we don't want to just wait for permission to talk. A big underlying theme here is about agency. It's about taking your own agency, defining whether it's when you're going to come out, defining how you want to find safety, defining what brings you happiness and fulfillment, which is just as much an important part of this. I think I'm so thrilled because a lot of times, as I talked about at the start of this episode, there's a lot of discussion on the doom and gloom, and oftentimes people who get marginalized, that's the only story they get to share. It's just as important to understand the thriving and seeing you vibrant human beings in your professional and social endeavors, doing as best you can and doing things that call to your heart is very, very, very critical for folks to see and understand, because it helps create a sense of not just representation in the classical sense, but you don't know what you don't know, and seeing artists and performers and clinicians and professionals, in all your different intersections and endeavors, that's inspiration for folks. And whether you're trans or not, it's inspiration for folks. And before we sort of close out today, I would like people to sort of know, if you want, as you talked about some books and some professional practices, we'd like people to sort of know where they can find you. If you got some closing words for us, doing a little sign-offs here. We'll start with Laurel.
Yeah, gosh, I'm all over the internet at non-binary cowboy. So NONBINARY cowboy, a word you've heard before. And on Twitter, just take off that Y. They won't let you have a username that long. So thanks for having me.
So it's on Twitter, it's non-binary cowboy.
Yep. Yeah.
Noopur.
Yes. Y'all can find me on Instagram. I think, what is my username? Right. It is my first name, Noopur.shah13. Yeah, I generally don't use Twitter too much. But yeah, I feel really grateful for being part of this panel, and also just like, I don't know, it feels inspiring to like meet all of you, like, and know that like we are represented in so many colors and in so many ways. Thanks for having me.
Neat.
Well, I'm not all over the internet, but I am on Facebook. You can find me there at Running Rewired is the handle, and my website is also runningrewired.com. It also redirects from natecannon.org. So you can go to either of those and they'll land you at the same place to learn a little bit more about what I do. I do have a couple of books that are for sale through the website there, and also are linked to Kindle, Nook, and every other kind of platform that you'd like to potentially read on. So feel free to check those out. And if you know any groups that might benefit from hearing me speak, feel free to shoot me an email as well. That information, the contact info is on my website.
Yeah. And Ryan?
You could find me at Ryan Casada on all social media, or just type in my name. And I just want to remind everyone to stay true, stay you, and continue having hope. And remember that we're all in this together, and that I love you, and I hope that you will love yourself and be kind to yourself. You deserve it.
Oh, that's perfect. I'm not even going to make a closing note. So with that, I want to thank every one of our guest members on this panel. Noopur, Laurel, Ryan, Nate, you've been phenomenal. Conversations Cafe cannot exist and cannot happen without our amazing production team. Mike Van Opel, Rick Osowski, Vicky Cisnet, Macy, Duncan, and Angel. You all rock. Appreciate you. And I want to thank all of you watching now or engaging in this content later on for joining us yet again for another Conversations Cafe. I hope you have a wonderful evening and be well. Good night, everybody.
What's cracking, Hope Nation? Today we are all lucky to be a part of the Conversation Summit, which is devoted to building networks for altering destinies. We are striving to create an experience that carries far beyond today. This summit is designed to guide attendees toward identifying issues with mental health in our communities and institutions while exploring how we can directly make a positive impact and affect great change. This summit is less about listening to panels of speakers and more about connecting with a diverse assembly of community members to share, learn, and inspire one another through one common denominator, that is, hope for the day. Today we celebrate mental health activism, advocacy, and nurturing the importance of self-care. My name is Kevin Hines, and in the year 2000, I attempted to die by my hands from lethal emotional pain by way of suicide. I survived the fall off the Golden Gate Bridge with the help of a sea lion that kept me afloat, the Coast Guard, and onlookers passing by, along with one heck of a back surgeon who saved me the ability to walk, stand, and run. As it is, 99% of those who've jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge never again get to tell their stories. They're gone forever. I got the gift of a second chance at this life. Since being given that gift and hearing from everyone around me that I should tell my story, I took my lived experience, expertise, and I turned it into a mission of a positive impact. Initially, I had no intention of telling my story until one day in my first psych ward of 9 psych ward stays in the next 14 years, all for suicidal ideation, a Franciscan friar named Brother George Cherry told me I should talk about my story. He told me I should use it to help people. I had no idea what he meant, nor the impact my story could have on the people listening to it. So I ignored him. Every day he came in to my room, every day he'd tell me I need to tell my story, talk about this. And every day I would brush it off my shoulders and just ignore the guy and think he was silly. After getting out of my first psych ward stay, and my father and I went to church on a Sunday, which was nearing Good Friday. Father Michael Harriman came out of the service when it was over, and he said to me, and I quote, "Kevin, how would you like to come and share your experience this Good Friday?" I looked at him and I said, "Oh, Father, I don't have a speech and I wouldn't know what to say." And that's when my dad shoved me forward and said, "He'll do it." I turned back to my dad. I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You'll do it, Kevin. We need closure." And I'm like, "You need closure? I need to go home and lay down. My back hurts." You know, that's what I was thinking the whole time. But when Pat Hines says things twice, you do them. He's 6'1" and I'm not. I didn't think my story would have an impact. I certainly wasn't prepared for what happened next. I went to the school on that Good Friday. I told my truth. I dropped page by page to the floor of my speech. There was 17 pages, 45 minutes to read aloud. Crying and shaking like a leaf the whole time. It was raw. It was real. Immediately after my presentation, 8 hands went up. And judging by the nature of their questions, intelligent, intriguing, important, one thing was crystal clear. I had made a massive impact on these kids. 2 weeks later, Father Harriman called me to the rectory and handed me a manila envelope, and he said, "Open it." I found inside 120 letters from 120 kids, several of which were written about their active suicidal ideation. We were able to get to them in time, and they're alive today. You see, you and your story can help transform a destiny if you learn how to tell it in a way that highlights positivity, hope, and future-based perspectives. Your story could be the impetus to someone taking a completely different path in their life. I can't tell you how many people have told me that my story changed their life forever, brought them back to faith, encouraged them to go into psychology or psychiatry, even saved their life. You must never forget how powerful your story can truly be, and share it with as many people who are willing to listen as possible. Through the power of your story, you can disrupt discrimination and marginalization against those with mental health struggles and crises. You can influence peers, and you can even make a massive impact on institutions to create environments supportive of mental, mind, behavioral health, suicide prevention, and all-around well-being and wellness. Your positive impacts and the effects could be limitless, and the only thing stopping you from making such a difference is you. So I urge you to go forth, share your stories, and inspire hope, love, and light throughout your communities, no matter what we look like, no matter who we love, no matter where we go in our lives, and no matter what our ethnic makeup or background is. I can tell you one thing is completely and totally clear. One thing is positively the same amongst all of us. Each of our stories matters, and each of our stories has the power to change another's life forever. Remember, to be well, to be kind, compassionate, loving, caring, and empathetic to every single person you ever come into contact with, no matter their behavior toward you, because you never know what they're going through or what they've been through, to make them the way they are today. And don't forget, the most important thing, be kind and forgiving of yourself. We're all 1,000 times greater than the worst thing you've ever done. And lastly, whatever the heck you do, be here tomorrow and every damn day after that. You're beautiful just as you are. You're intended to be here until your natural end. And suicide is never or should never be the solution to your problem. It is the problem. You are meant to be here. You are loved, and you matter.